Greetings, VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. The big story this week is about something that hasn't happened yet, but everyone expects it to happen any day now, and that's a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip to include the release of more Israeli hostages. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump says he expects this to happen within a week, but Hamas is flatly rejecting any and all proposals that will compel it to meet Israel halfway. Meanwhile, the Iranians are once again making threats that they're going to attack Israel again, and this time they won't hold anything back. All that and more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. As I said, the big story this week is about polls that indicate nearly 75% of Israel's voting public are now in favor of agreeing to the terms Hamas is demanding in exchange for returning Israel's remaining hostages and ending this war. Now, before I go on any further, I'm sure you'll want to know what the terms Hamas is demanding to be met before they'll agree to the release of the remaining hostages and sign a ceasefire agreement. Well, to start with, they want the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, to completely withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and they want international guarantees that Israel won't start attacking them again for at least 5 years. Of course, they aren't making any promises that they won't attack Israel for 5 years, let alone build tunnels, and in fact, they're giving every indication that they will make preparations to do that very thing, and they reserve the right to attack Israel whenever they feel ready to do so once again. Friends, this is like if a basketball team said they wanted guarantees from the referees that the other team wouldn't try to score any baskets for the next half hour of playtime. In fact, they want the refs to force the other team to sit on the bench while they continue to be on the court making as many baskets as they can do to run up the score over the next 30 minutes. And then, when the final buzzer sounds, they'll dance around the court, hugging each other, hoisting the trophy, taunting the losing team, and basking in the cheers from the audience, which in this metaphor is composed of the UN, students at Western universities, etc. Now, I know that's not a perfect metaphor, but if you get the point, I should add that they also want hundreds of Palestinian security prisoners being held in Israeli jails to be released for every Israeli hostage they release. This has always been, in my humble opinion, an outrageous travesty, and even more so under the current circumstances, which I'll talk about in a moment. In any case, the demands Hamas is making before they'll agree to release the remaining hostages and agree to a one-sided ceasefire are so absurd that they should obviously be rejected outright. But like I said, according to a recent poll, almost 3 out of 4 members of Israel's voting public is ready to agree to these terms. And you're probably wondering why they would do that. Well, I'm glad you asked, and I'm happy to give you the answer, which is multifaceted, but can also be boiled down to one word, and that word is fatigue. This war has been going on far longer than any of Israel's previous wars, with the possible exception of Operation Peace for Galilee, which was launched in 1982 and was meant to be a brief, powerful offensive into southern Lebanon to drive the PLO from the border so they'd stop launching rockets into southern Israel. The plan worked, maybe a little too well, and the PLO was soon on its way to a long exile in faraway Tunisia. That's a long story which we don't have time to get into, but the point is getting the PLO out of Lebanon somehow turned out to be the easy part. The IDF then somehow or other got into a situation where it was deployed in southern Lebanon, babysitting the different warring factions there, not wanting to stay but unable to leave. It might not have been an active war by the technical definition, but it wasn't peace either. In the meantime, there continued to be a steady trickle of casualties among the IDF troops involved, and those casualties counted whether it was technically a war or not. That's kind of what's starting to feel like now in Gaza, and that's why so many Israelis seem to be ready to just give Hamas what they want to get the hostages back and get it over with already. These poor hostages have been in captivity under brutal conditions for almost 22 months, and 20 of the 50 remaining are firmly believed to still be alive. Of course, we want the remains of the other 30 back as well, so their families can bury them in a dignified way. But the 20 who remain alive are what we're most concerned with. I'm sure there are also millions of Israelis who worry about their sons, husbands, brothers, fathers, etc., who have been mobilized into the reserves and who are facing great danger every single day they're in Gaza. Now, on this last note, I want to tell you that VFI has many supporters and volunteers who move all over Israel, and many of them live in these communities and neighborhoods. They see and hear things that are hard to put into any kind of flowchart or spreadsheet. To sum it all up for you, I will simply say that although Israelis are generally thrilled to have won such a stunning victory in this war, which saw us attacked on 7 kinetic fronts, they're also tired, if not exhausted. This war has been hard on marriages and families. Wives have gone months at a time without seeing their husbands, and children have gone months without seeing their fathers. That was necessary because these men had to be in the IDF reserves, fighting this war. But it's led to some heartbreaking results, including skyrocketing rates of divorce, children suffering all kinds of emotional disorders, communities disrupted, small businesses ruined, and on it goes. Add to that the tremendous amount of physical damage we've suffered because of the rockets, drones, and missiles that have been fired into Israel from Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and most of all, from Iran itself. All of this has caused nearly 7 billion shekels worth of property damage, and the government is going to be covering most of that, in addition to the tens of billions of shekels it's spent on weapons, ammunition, and equipment for the IDF. They're going to be paying for that with tax increases on one hand and cuts to social welfare benefits on the other. And when you add that to the nearly 2 years in which entire industries in Israel, especially tourism and agriculture, have been, for all intents and purposes, out of business, and you can begin to see where I'm going with all of this. Israel needs help, and I mean a lot of help. The direct cost of this war might be close to 100 billion shekels by the time it's all said and done, and the indirect costs will probably be even more than that. We'll be paying the bills for many years, and by we, I mean ordinary Israelis who live and die, work, pay taxes, send our children to school, and later the IDF, and somehow still have to pay all our other bills. At Vision for Israel, we've never been busier than we have been over the past 2 years because there's never been such tremendous need for our many social welfare programs. The cuts to government programs, which have only just begun and will probably last for a very long time, have opened up cracks that we're trying to fill before too many people fall through it. We've got a warehouse near Jerusalem where we receive large shipments of various items, household supplies through the front door every day, and every day large quantities of this stuff get sent out the back door to be delivered to people who need it all over the country. This is just one of the many programs we have, so please watch this short video about some of the other things we're doing to be a blessing to the people of Israel in this difficult time. We all know that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Welcome back, friends. Now, as I said before, the big question facing Israelis this week is whether or not we should agree to the terms Hamas is demanding in exchange for the return of our remaining hostages and agreeing to a long-term ceasefire. Like I said before to many people, including me, that seems really outrageous, especially since the IDF now has physical control of almost 80% of the Gaza Strip and Hamas has been completely defeated on the battlefield. They're losing more and more fighters every day, and other armed factions, including tribal clans that can make no secret of their association with Israel, are openly challenging Hamas for control of the civilian population. Hamas is ruthless, they're demonic, and they need to be done with. Last but certainly not least, everyone knows that Iran is in no position after it got severely pounded by Israel and the United States in last month's 12-day war to send any more assistance to Hamas or Hezbollah or anyone else. We'll talk more about Iran in a moment, but first I need to talk about some other factors that are at play here. One person who really wants the war in Gaza to end is U.S. President Donald Trump, and the reasons why have little to do with what's going on in Gaza. Let me explain. For starters, President Trump and his administration see the war in Gaza as having accomplished everything that there might have been to accomplish, and it's now just distracting from other much more important geopolitical priorities. To use an old-fashioned metaphor, President Trump and the Pentagon have bigger fish to fry, starting with Russia. President Trump campaigned on a promise to end the war between Russia and the Ukraine quickly, and as the months drag on and the war continues, this is both embarrassing and politically risky for him. It is also embarrassing, not to mention infuriating, the way Russian President Vladimir Putin continues to launch massive air attacks on Ukrainian cities despite President Trump's demands for this to stop. So now, Trump appears to have decided that it's time to punish the Kremlin by selling more weapons to NATO countries so they can pass them along to Ukraine and also increase secondary sanctions meant to squeeze the already fragile Russian economy. President Trump is also being urgently advised by the Pentagon that far too much ammunition is being used up in the Middle Eastern wars, leaving the arsenal of democracy with a thin reserve with which to deter Chinese aggression against American allies in Eastern Asia. Last, but certainly not least, President Trump wants the war in Gaza to end quickly because the Houthis in Yemen are using the ongoing conflict as an excuse to resume attacks on ships moving through international waters of the Indian Ocean, Bab el-Mandab Straits, and the Red Sea. They've also fired a handful of ballistic missiles at Israel since the end of the conflict with Iran. But these missiles are more of a nuisance than a real threat, although they can't be ignored. However, President Trump tried to sort out the Houthis with a large-scale campaign of airstrikes, and that didn't work, for reasons that would take a long time to explain. The short version, though, is that Yemen is a big country with lots of caves and ravines where it's easy to hide ballistic missile launchers and other weapons. The Houthis also have no problem using the Yemeni people as human shields. The only way the Houthis will ever be kinetically sorted out is by a large-scale ground invasion of Yemen, and no one is going to do that, not for now anyways, so something else must be tried. President Trump apparently thinks that if the war in Gaza ends, that will give the Houthis a face-saving way to stop their attacks on shipping, and then everyone can go on living happily ever after and go back to ignoring them. Well, that's a deeply problematic solution to this problem, but I must admit that from an American perspective, it makes some sense. Another thing that makes a lot of sense from the American perspective is a desire to expand the Abraham Accords, and this is also something that greatly interests many Israelis. Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and even Syria and Lebanon are quietly expressing great interest in normalizing relations with Israel. That's unbelievable. This has the potential to lead to all kinds of very positive things for everyone, including me. I can go visit these countries. Except the Ayatollah regime in Iran and some of America's other enemies, they of course don't like it. It would also certainly free up resources that the United States and its European allies could put to good use in other parts of the world. And it would also unlock tremendous economic potential that both Israel and America, as well as many other countries in the Middle East, Europe and beyond, would benefit from. Now, ending the war in Gaza is a necessary first step towards moving forward with all that, and everyone knows it. Remember what I said about the economic hardship many Israelis are dealing with right now? This would go a long way towards solving that problem, along with many other problems Israelis face. Once again, everyone knows this, but there's also one group of Israelis who are staunchly opposed to a ceasefire on Hamas's terms, despite all that, and they are represented in the Knesset by parties who hold key positions in the governing coalition. I'm talking, of course, about Itamar Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, whose names will no doubt be familiar to many of the viewers of this program. These two faction leaders have told Netanyahu point blank that they will leave the coalition if a ceasefire happens before Hamas is completely destroyed. But if I can switch to commentary mode for a second, I don't believe that the goal of completely destroying Hamas can ever be accomplished. Hamas is not just a terrorist organization, it's an ideology, just like the Nazi Party in Germany was, and the Communist Party in the Soviet Union were. Nazi Germany was militarily defeated, but the ideology behind it is still with us to this day, and it inspires millions of people, including Hamas, all over the world. The same can be said of communism and many other similar ideas. Hamas represents an ideology that includes elements of Palestinian nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism, which are contradictory to each other, but also complementary, if that makes sense. In any case, the ideology of Hamas will survive and continue to be a problem for Israel long after this war ends, one way or the other. Candidly, I think it's out of order for Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition partners to demand the continuation of this war until Hamas is completely defeated, disregarding both the obvious desire of the U.S. president and the polls, which shows the obvious desire of such a large percentage of the Israeli electorate. I try not to run these guys down too much, but the fact is they're exploiting their leverage over Netanyahu to a degree that is utterly outrageous, even by historic Israeli standards. So if you've studied Israeli history at all, you know what I'm comparing this moment to, and you might even be shocked what I'm about to say. But even if you don't know what I'm referring to, the point is this has gone too far and something needs to change. On that note, I'll stay in commentary mode for a bit longer and take note of the fact that no matter what, the next election is scheduled to take place no later than October of 2026, just 15 months from now. It's very difficult to imagine anything that could happen over those 15 months that will improve Netanyahu's chances in the next election. Now, in order to prevent them from bolting his coalition and forcing a new election, that's a mistake. On the other hand, I suppose it's possible that Netanyahu knows something the rest of us don't, and he's resisting the calls to agree to a ceasefire for very good reasons that have nothing to do with politics. That's not so easy to believe, however, when we remember that it's unlikely Netanyahu knows things that President Trump doesn't know. Historically, President Trump has been very sympathetic and supportive to Israeli concerns, and I want to say thank you, President Trump. So if there's something really vital to Israel's national interest that are keeping Netanyahu from moving forward with the ceasefire, then I tend to think that Trump would understand. The fact that he's pushing for a ceasefire, despite whatever it might be that Netanyahu is telling him he needs more time for, makes me think that it's probably not so vital to anything other than Netanyahu's coalition in the Knesset. Now, there's one more issue that needs to be addressed before moving on, and that's the lingering moral outrage against Hamas for the massacre they committed against Israelis on October 7, 2023. Fairness compels me to say that this is part of what motivates Ben Gvir and Smotrich to continue pushing for the war to continue. And these men also represent a segment of Israeli society that feels that this is a moral imperative despite the strategic consequences. So with that in mind, let me be very candid with you and say that the intense pain, anger, and anguish that resulted from the October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel are beginning to cool off. We'll never forget what happened that day, but as I look around Israeli society, I'm beginning to get the sense that people are coming to terms with it. That's not to say we're making peace with it, but we're coming to terms with it. The shock and disbelief are wearing off, and that's partly because so many other things have happened since then. As awful as the Hamas massacres of October 7, 2023 were, everyone understands that what Hezbollah planned to do in the Galilee would have been much worse. Beyond that, the threat to Israel from Iran, which for a time was directly supported by the Assad regime in Syria, was close to being existential. But Israel decisively defeated Hezbollah in a series of lightning attacks, and a short time later, the Assad regime in Syria was overthrown by forces that had only been holding back because they were deterred by Hezbollah. Now, these forces were led by a former al-Qaeda strongman named Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, and to everyone's amazement, including me, he's actually talking to the Americans about the possibility of joining the Abraham Accords. Nevertheless, the threat of attacks on Israel's home front remains very real. So here at Vision for Israel, we're continuing to install bomb safety shelters to Israeli communities. So please watch this short video about this vitally important project. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture and Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, friends, and now let's move on to the renewed threats that Iran is making to once again attack Israel. Good luck, guys. Well, the ostensible reason for these threats is that Iran is saying Israel tried to assassinate their President Masoud Pezeshkian. A report surfaced over the weekend in the Fars news agency, which is a mouthpiece for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, saying that on June 16th, amidst Operation Rising Lion, an airstrike was carried out on a building in Tehran. This building was the site of a meeting of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, which was chaired by Pezeshkian, who was lightly wounded in the leg. Maybe he needed a Band-Aid. An IRGC officer quoted in the report said that this constitutes an obvious attempt to assassinate the president of Iran and is unacceptable as a war crime that Israel must pay a high price for. Now, friends, these are all kinds of reasons why I find the whole thing very fishy. First of all, it is well known that Israel took out at least 30 senior IRGC and Iranian military generals in the opening moves of Operation Rising Lion, and we found out about it almost immediately. So if Pezeshkian actually had been wounded in one of these strikes, why would we be just hearing about it now? Second, how on earth would Pezeshkian have escaped such an attack with a relatively light wound in the leg? Most people who are in buildings that get hit by Israeli missiles don't get off so easy. To put it bluntly, and maybe crudely, Israel knows how to assassinate Iranian officials, and almost everyone that Israel made a serious attempt to assassinate is no longer alive. And by the way, has anyone seen pictures of this wound he supposedly suffered, or any other evidence that he was the target of any kind of attack? I think the more likely explanation is that Iran's leaders are very embarrassed at the lopsided victory Israel won in the 12-day war, and they are looking for an excuse to provoke another round so they can try again to inflict massive damage on Israel and leave everyone, especially their own people, thinking they've retrieved their lost honor. To that I would say, on behalf of all Israelis, how about no? How about the IRGC and the Ayatollahs trying to fix their own problems by causing problems for everyone else? It's not too much to ask. Now we're out of time for this report, and I want to continue the tradition of ending with some good news. Good news is always good news. International airlines are returning to Israel as this war draws to a close, and this is just one of the many signs that the economy is on the road to recovery. On the road again. Well, that road will be long and difficult, but we're very ready to get moving along it. And on that note, I'm looking forward to flying overseas the first chance I can get whenever I can to visit all of you. So on that note, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel. Shalom, my friends.